wrote a beginner's book. And in writing the book and in going to see some classes in preparation for that, I started thinking about kind of principles that I've been following. And in some ways, I think that beginners, in a way, are a kind of test bed for any kind of approach or method, in the sense that everything is in an extreme. So you have students who are maybe know nothing. So we have mixed levels in most classes, but at the lowest level, that becomes kind of slightly more problematic, because basically some people don't understand anything, whereas some can actually communicate in some ways. So I started thinking about this, and the idea of this talk is some of them, the material you'll see is from outcomes, but it'll be looking at the kind of principles underlying teaching lexically or a lexical approach. So the first question might be this: is Julie right? Are we familiar with Julie Andrews, Sound of Music? Start from the very beginning. Very good place to start. When we learn to read, we start with ABC. And when we sing, we start with Do, Re, Mi. Yeah. I kind of wonder whether that's true, though, particularly when it comes to reading and speaking, because when we read, actually we start with A, B, K. Kind of learning ABC is actually not very helpful, because that's not how we sound out and use phonics. And actually, when it comes to singing, the place I started singing was just singing and having a go at it. And it seems to me that both of these ideas we should bear in mind when it comes to teaching language. We'll come back to it in a moment. My point would be also, though, that this is a kind of inherited way of thinking about learning. So that when we come to teaching, basically we come to teaching because we've been taught and we have a particular way of doing things. And then when we come to our own classes, inevitably there's a certain kind of repetition which takes place. And certainly within the whole of a community, they know, they have experience of what teaching is and how language should be learned. But these folk ways are not necessarily the best ways, is what I would suggest. And in a way, this might be what we see in beginner level books. So what we have is a very rigid syllabus. Now, what I'm looking at here are international books, the kind that I write. So they're kind of global ones. It may be that they're in individual countries, they're a slightly different syllabus. But if you look at any kind of one like, Cutting Edge, English File, Headway, Global, all these kinds of books, they basically follow pretty much exactly the same syllabus. So we would start with what's your name? Fair enough. Then we would have B plus short answers. Yes, I am. No, I'm not. Then we might have some countries, alphabet, spelling out. And basically we spend the first 4 units on the verb to be, followed by present simple, followed by past simple, etc. Okay? Going to quite often might not appear in the book at all. Have been, beginner book, basically never. Just doesn't appear. Better or best. I mean, we kind of focus on the tenses, but actually a lot of other grammar, better, best, any kind of comparative, just doesn't appear. Okay? Is that a good thing? The result is we end up with conversations like this. So just for a moment, here we have some. Ellie isn't from the United States, from England. Is Javier Bardem Mexican? No, he isn't. Is that a hat? Yes, it is. How do you spell Dubai? Just with the person next to you, why might you say these things? Who to? When? And if there isn't a good answer to those, is there a more normal thing you might ask or say in those situations? What other language might you need as you're having those conversations? Quickly, with the person next to you, have a go. What do you think? Go. Okay, stop there. So maybe the first one you could imagine some particular scenario you might say that. And as we go down, is that a hat? Yes, it is. Can you imagine when you might say this? In a hat shop? Not really. It's a strange thing to ask. And why would we be asking to spell Dubai? I don't know, maybe you can think of a reason. The way I kind of think of it, these might be slightly more realistic conversations, things which you might come across. So where's Javier from? I think he's from Spain. Where's Javier from? I don't know. What's gorro in English? Hat. Did you have a good journey? Yes, it was fine. What are you doing now? I'm going for coffee. Have you been there before? No. My point is, what you need for this in the first instance is I think and I don't know, but we can't teach that till Unit 5 because that's present tense. So there's a kind of rigidity which excludes these kinds of things. Actually, they are changing slightly, but generally they're not kind of focused on. And obviously we can't teach, there's a tendency to avoid translation, so we shouldn't say what's gorro in English. It carries on though more than that, because when you restrict the grammar in this way, there's a kind of demand to restrict the vocabulary as well. That we can only have certain kinds of conversations. So if you can't say, I don't know, then we have to have this constant kind of misunderstanding. Are you from Czechoslovakia? No, I'm from Russia. Are you from France? No, I'm from Russia. Are you from, etc. And in a way, this is what then happens. So we have a kind of rigidity also in the way of the vocabulary we teach. As we saw, typically, numbers, days of the week, nationalities, countries, and the names of the letters. And I want to suggest that actually the names of the letters are words in and of themselves, because A, B, C is not what we say when we're reading. They are essentially learning the words, the names of those letters. So if you look, this is from one course book, but it would be fairly typical. There's 108 words out of this group that we've got here. Just with the person next to you, how many different conversations can you kind of have that you might want to have outside the class? How many conversations does this kind of enable? How many situations could you work with? With the person next to you, have a think about it. Go.
Коллеги, школа Дмитрия Никитина приглашает вас на курс Teaching Teens. Это трехмесячный онлайн-курс, созданный для преподавателей, обучающих учеников подросткового возраста 13-18 лет. Создавая курс, мы задали себе два ключевых вопроса. Как наиболее эффективно формировать у подростков языковые умения и как интегрировать в программу обучения английскому языку механизмы развития soft skills. Курс проводится на английском языке. Подробности можно узнать по QR-коду на экране или по ссылке в описании.
So, we can say hello, we can greet each other, we can say goodbye. We could vary it by saying, see you on Monday, see you on Tuesday. This is a good little chunk that we can make use of. But essentially, we are restricted in how many things we can talk about. Basically, we're restricted to talking about, where are you from? I'm from Canada. No, I'm not. I'm from Russia, etc., etc. Maybe we could talk about nationalities. Is he Spanish? No, he's not. He's Mexican, etc., etc. Maybe we could talk about, where is, what kind of car is it I've seen in these things? So it's a German car, it's a Spanish car. But then we need car. We start needing other vocabulary. So that's not necessarily a problem, but we can see how there's a kind of restriction on what we can do with this kind of language. The key takeaway from this, maybe, for all levels, is the danger of lexical sets, which I shall return to later. That we have an obsession with teaching everything in groups of connected topic words. And actually, this is the same problem quite often, is that the things you are able to say with those words are actually kind of restricted. So, if you're talking about transport, various types of transport, then when you are talking about them, you're not going to have a conversation where you mention 6 types of transport. There's a lot of other language there which is needed. Same at a higher level, when you're teaching crimes, murder, something was stolen, robbery, robber, etc. Actually, when you're talking about those, what's happened, maybe a news story or something that happened to you, you're going to need a whole load of other language which is actually nothing to do with that. For those who've been to my talks before, I'm afraid I'll be using the same example, which is, somebody comes up to me, started talking to me, they grabbed my bag and ran off. This is the language you need for explaining about a robbery. But it's not often the language which we teach, because we're focused on that lexical set. So we can just go, somebody stole something. And then the problem the students then have is actually explaining further about it. So here is an alternative choice. You'll notice it's the same number of words, but I've chosen slightly different ones. They are maybe somewhat decided through frequency, thinking a little bit more about the frequency of the words, not all of them, but have a look now. So again, with the person next to you, how many different conversations or kind of situations could you make use of these words? Go with the person next to you. Okay, get the idea. Hopefully you'll feel there's a somewhat wider range of things we can talk about. So one of the things when it comes to beginners, particularly, I think this is specific to beginners, is taking, for example, numbers. So this is a kind of central thing that we might want to learn, and is to work out, in a way, instead of thinking of just of learning them, the words as numbers and the noun and as them as numbers, that we try to think of the kinds of questions which we can make use of these numbers. So this then leads to a different type of set, in a way. And fundamentally actually means learning a lot more questions at an earlier stage. So learning how long is the class. Okay, we need the extra, I think we had minutes there, so 35 minutes or 45 minutes. How old are you, obviously? How old is your son? So it's our choice of words is thinking about what will it enable us to do the kinds of conversations we can have. So it's conversation-driven as a point of the syllabus and an outcome goal, rather than the idea of working backwards from, we need to teach this set of grammar in this order. Okay? What if they don't know the answer? What if they need to try and say something they don't know? This is very often the response I get to the suggestion, for example, of teaching more questions and allowing more of these questions to come up. My answer would be, you could teach them the answer. It's very simple. Just following the student will obviously come up with other things. So if you take the idea, you will have seen there, we had, where are you from? So on one level, where are you from? We can just, and the example I would give to begin with is simply the name of the city, which will be the same in any country. So we can make use of that. In the first instance, we don't need any names of countries. The second thing, though, if you are and in your context, presumably most of your students are all from Russia, so there is a kind of limit to that kind of conversation. The real conversation is where you're from. Actually, probably where do you live might be a better one. But if you then come with the answers, in my context, where I'm teaching multilingual classes, where are you from? Latvia, Lithuania. These words will never appear in the list of beginner student countries and nationalities. But those are obviously the words which that particular student needs. So my suggestion is, rather than sometimes choosing the set, that we think about how the conversation works and allow some of this language just to emerge in response to what the students need, rather than what we dictate as the appropriate list to give. Okay? So, if you think about the underlying principles, something I'll be talking about later as well, I like to think about what is driving these choices. If you think about what is the underlying principles within a beginner or elementary course, you've got grammar plus words. The words are usually taught as sets. So words should be taught in a connected set of a topic. That's a kind of underlying principle of these material. The grammar is a building block, so that we have to master the present simple, master to some degree, before we can move on to, in fact, verb to be, before we can use the verb present simple. So 4 units of be, then present simple, present negatives, etc. There's a kind of mastery building block. And now what goes with that is that the language, that new language, should not be seen or heard until we have taught it. So the point is that you will simply not see the word went before unit 10 in your beginner book, or unit 6 or 5 or 6 in your elementary book. It's literally not in any of the material before then. Is this a principle we agree with? Is this a good kind of methodology? Alongside of that is, we could say that the genuine purpose and usage is relatively unimportant. That, we teach these kinds of dialogues that we saw, is that a hat? Because we're teaching, is that? Without any kind of, we learn from that the grammar, which then allows us to have other conversations. Again, you might question whether that is the principles which you really believe in. Frequency is relatively unimportant, hence we teach the names of letters and the names of various countries. None of these would be in the top 500 most common words in English. Acquisition or self-teaching doesn't happen. This is, if it did, we wouldn't worry about people not being able to answer the question because they, apart from me telling them, they can just look it up in a dictionary. Maybe one of those bilingual dictionaries. Oh, shouldn't have that in the classroom. No encounters beyond the classroom. Maybe there was a time where we were all in kind of, no internet. Students had no access to any other language. So there was some kind of positive idea of staging this language. But if the students are either, in my context, walking out the door and hearing all kinds of English, or just going online, this kind of restriction of exposure to different types of language, to me, seems not realistic anymore. And then there's an idea that everybody's a homogenous group, so they're basically all at the same level, they're all complete beginners, they're all doing the same thing, and they're all progressing in the same way, which, again, I would suggest not true. Maybe the real nonsense, though, is that elementary books follow exactly the same pattern. So you have to wait then. So we've done present and we've done past, supposedly. But when we start elementary, we can't have any past examples until page 50, page 54. So actually we're restarting everything all over again. So what's the principles there? Basically, don't repeat a new structure until it's been forgotten. You can't see very frequent grammar or words for 200 hours. I'm talking about been. It's in the top 100 most common words in English. Have to, must, should, shall, was-ing, all kinds of other words. And then this last comment came from some users of our books who we were working with, and he was saying that in England, where they were working, that it also had the effect of basically socially isolating the students. Because if they have to wait for like the whole of the beginner course to have a conversation of what are you doing after the class, one can presume the students make their best efforts at having those conversations, but wouldn't it be much better if we'd helped them in the class to do it? So they're unable to take part in those kind of conversations, and to some degree, perhaps infantilized, and we may come back to that later. So my alternative would be that perhaps we could be conversation, not grammar-driven. Students will always want to say more, and we could help them do that. In the first instance, but I think this is true of all levels actually, that we could sometimes just give enough grammar and perhaps some grammaticalized chunks to enable conversations rather than the conversation being defined by the grammar. We need, and this is the most important thing perhaps, these kind of repeated comprehensible inputs and interactive output, I would say, over time. So one of the problems is that we're crushing everything, all present simple in one go, all past simple in one go, later levels, all conditionals in one go. And are they getting the recycling of these structures at other moments? Sometimes either teachers or the material will kind of move on to something else and they don't get the chance to have those kind of new conditional conversations. And then the last one is, obviously we can learn vocabulary and it's a good idea to do so, but perhaps it's best not done in sets. Perhaps it's best driven by the conversation and the needs of the conversation. Okay? Just check with the person next to you. How do you feel about these alternative views? The two views presented so far, which one would you go with? Any thoughts? Go. Okay, let's move on. Any questions so far? Anybody like to ask? Right. So, how might this look? So this is from the beginner book, but as I'm going to point out and repeatedly point out, actually it's less to do with the material and more to do with the syllabus and the way of thinking of the teacher. So if we give here, we teach the word best. If I was in a monolingual situation, like I was in Spain, I would go, best, yeah, it means mejor. Okay, where's the best restaurant? Where's the best place to go? It's best to take the bus. Discuss, where do you think the best restaurant is in Yaroslavl? Any suggestions? Everywhere, okay, maybe. You don't have a favourite, where's the best, etc. So, in a way, we'll see in a moment. And then the similar one, have you been? So we're happy to teach perhaps would you like to, or would you like a coffee as a chunk. To my mind, have you been plus place is just one, it's exactly the same kind of thing. So if it's okay for would you like, why not for have you been? And the answers in this case are very simple. So in both cases, there's a kind of level thing that we could exploit. And so this would be another aspect of what I would say is teaching lexically. The first is because we're using real examples, things which people might actually say, for the lowest student, they can basically learn it by heart and make use of it. There's a kind of copying and repeating. But for the higher student, the way I would think about it is I would be thinking about how that conversation then might develop. So pushing them beyond the simple answers that they would give. So, again, just with the person next to you, how might those conversations begin? What other language might the students want or need or have a go at trying to say? So, just have the basic, have a go, just have the little conversations yourselves and see what other language might be needed. Go. Okay? Any suggestions? So like on the first one, the best one, how might this become extended? Why? Yeah, exactly. So, what's the best restaurant? So-and-so, why? It's cheap, it's nice, it's tasty. So, and at that point, we can adapt the language which we give to the level of those students. So we can imagine in a class, in any beginner class, actually there's usually only 2 genuine beginners. And there's like 8 really elementary students who haven't kind of, we need to have enough people in the class to make it profitable. And so we might ask them, why? They might already say, it's cheap. And you'd say, okay, good. Is it good? And then we might want to teach them, it's cheap or good value, perhaps, or it's good quality, depending on the students, seeing how well they get on. Okay, any other things which we might want to add there?
Maybe something that can be said before this dialogue, so not only studying it afterwards, but put it before.
Okay, like it. Yes, so go on. Yes, okay, yeah, exactly. So we could build it into a kind of different scenario where we're kind of talking about it. Any other suggestions?
I was thinking of scene inspired me as well.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so, you might want to just give them exactly 1 or 2. So one of the ideas of teaching lexically, or a lexical approach, is the idea that with any kind of grammar structure, the vast majority of the examples of that structure will be a very small number of verbs. So if we take present perfect, actually we could say, yes, we can give them all the different endings, have you slept in a cave, have you ridden a camel, have you da-da-da-da, but actually the most common ones are going to be been, seen, done, tried, perhaps. So, I mean, we could think of like 5 which we could work with. And for my mind, actually the real difficulty for the students and developing their speaking and their ability to manage these conversations is less the learning of the present perfect, but more about the answers and how that conversation develops. Okay? So any other ones are anything else which we might have after have you been? How was it? Yeah. And again, you know, at a beginner level, the simple answer is good, bad. And that's it. We don't have to go any further. We might then go for why. And you could build it on that way. Again, depending on what you've taught before, how far you've got with it. Okay. I've lost me. Click. Yeah. So this is another one. It's a similar idea. I'll just show you this one because it builds into what we do next. So this is where are you going? It's the idea. It was basically a conversation I had in a train station in Switzerland, and somebody was helping me with the machine. So he asked, "Where am I going?" Told them, etc. The question I sometimes ask here is this present continuous for now or present continuous for future? We just don't know, really. So one of my key things as well, principles if you like, is that actually grammar meanings and actually word meanings are fuzzy. They're not clear-cut. So we can't just say, this is about the future, this is about the present. And that actually in doing so, perhaps we're creating more confusion and perhaps we could show a slightly different pattern. So this is the idea of then taking that idea of building conversations, building dialogues. They work from a normal, what do you normally do after the class? What do you normally do after work? The students have done a present simple. They'll say things like, go to gym. Usually say things incorrectly, but we'll kind of pass on that for the moment. Go home, or go to home, or go work, etc. And then what happens is they listen and hear a dialogue where people are having this discussion, and they will hear these, I need some money, I need to study, I need to eat something, going home, going to bed. In terms of vocabulary, I think we can agree it's very simple. But this is Unit 5 in our beginner book. Okay, it wouldn't appear till, well, I mean, perhaps we wouldn't have this at all, actually, until the end, because we're mixing, I'm going home and I'm going to have a coffee. Going to for future. Oh, go, right, okay. So my idea here is that we just have enough. So we presenting this, what we're doing is we're just presenting I'm going, we're going in the first instance, and we're showing pattern, we're showing grammar. I call this grammar, but it's a slightly different kind of grammar. It's kind of a lexical pattern. So after going, I'm going or we're going, you can follow it by a place, home, to gym, to the cinema, or an activity, which is essentially no different to want, how want works. I want a coffee, I want to go. I need a rest, I need to go. So it's a similar kind of pattern. And the students have to put it in order. So again, they're showing the pattern of the sentence, but they're not learning negatives. They're not learning about he and they at the moment. We're not asking what is he doing after the class or what your mother is doing later. It's not interesting. We want to know about you and I. And then we give them examples. It's built into a slightly bigger dialogue. So do you want to come? Which we've taught before. And then the students have the opportunity to write their own examples. Now, again, for the weakest students, they will just copy what they may have seen already. But it's usable. So one of my problems sometimes with the grammar plus words is if we have a thing like, are you wearing jeans, as an example of present continuous, when would you say it? Why would you say it? Essentially, what you're asking the students to do is to deconstruct that example and reconstruct it for the thing that they actually want to say, which is, what are you doing now? And some students will obviously expand on that and say different things. We can then add a question. Again, we're not asking lots of he, she, you questions. The students could just learn it with the basis of what, time, where, what. But because we taught in Unit 1 how, some students ask, how are you going? And because we taught them who, they might sometimes say, who are you going? Which is technically wrong. It should be who are you going with. But for my mind, is actually making use. It's enabling a conversation. So for me, that would be a successful achievement of the class. The impact of this is important, is this idea of the repetition over time. Because when you have this kind of traditional syllabus, the A's, the letters, represent the kind of tense, how they're presented. So kind of aspects of grammar. There are other grammar in these books, but I've kind of reduced it just as an example. So what you get is basically the 4 B's, then present simple, then we start getting past simple and a present revision, etc. So we cover those things. Once you've taught, if you're teaching a kind of what are you doing conversation, yes, later we may teach a conversation which is he, it, she's doing. But ideally in a conversation which they will be relatively natural. So they get a repeat of it later. The example of be here is there is. So very typically we'll get there is, there are, isn't, aren't, taught in one big group. But actually in the conversation, is there a coffee shop near here? Is there a cash machine near here? We only really need singular. We're not asking, we don't need to know how many coffee shops there are, we just want one. So then, in another unit, we can revise that and repass it, looking at there are. So then you're getting a kind of more hits repeated over time, recycling. And that has an impact just on the actual, literally, I just went through and looked at some examples. So we have 35 examples of being. Okay, these are all referring to being. So we have in the last 10 lessons over the last couple of units. Whereas if we're teaching it a little bit earlier and revisiting, and this excludes the ones which could happen in class, because obviously once we've taught what are you doing after the class, we could just ask that as a typical question every class. We're getting far more number of exposure to this pattern over a larger number of lessons. And I believe that leads to better learning. Having said that, and I shall be reiterating this later, students will still be beginners. They will not be having fluent conversations. They will be struggling. It's not about going from A to G in a kind of, beginner to proficiency in 6 months. It's really, for my mind, it's just changing the nature of the class, enabling the students to have a wider variety of conversations, being more adult with them, not infantilizing them so much. And this is the example of there is, there be. Same idea. When it comes to lexical sets, it's the same kind of problem. I have this example of way. It's the 4th most common word in English. But if you look in any kind of course book, beginner course book, in many it just doesn't appear. Simply because what is the lexical set it's fitting into? Not countries, not furniture, not shops, not many other things. And if you took this is, go on, just have a very quick one with a partner. How many of these would you say appear in your beginner courses? They're the top 100 most common nouns. And similarly, verbs. You know, would, will, could, may, should, might, all in the top 50 most common words in English. When do we teach them? Why do we not teach them till pre-intermediate or intermediate? I mean, you could just literally translate these words. The students are not going to produce and use them fluently. That's not the point. It's knowing the meaning, being able to expose to it. It's the fact that students aren't exposed to this language. I'm going to flick through this one quickly because we're almost out of time. So what I'd like to say is that this is not about using a particular course book. Obviously, I'm happy if you do. But it's more to do with the approach and the syllabus. So, for example, when it comes to teaching vocab, we could teach them not in sets, but thinking about the content of the unit, taking words from different parts of the unit, presenting those first. We might use flashcards. As a teacher, I would be doing it backwards and forwards in class, doing a lot more repetition than you would find in an actual course book, because the course book will just have one kind of listening, hear the word, second word, third word, fourth word, etc. As a teacher, I would never do that. I would be, what's the meaning of this one? Duh. Next one, duh. Third one, duh. What was the first one? And then going backwards and forwards and kind of thing, which I'm sure you do already. Similarly, with the dialogue that we had there, we can build it, and if you've been on one of our courses before, you might have seen this. You can work with the students to present, have you been to Yaroslav before? We drill that. Then we drill kind of yes, no answers. Then we might say, how was it? We drill that. And then we drill good. It was all right. And then we kind of build the conversation with the students. And again, going backwards and forwards, there's a lot of repetition, more repetition perhaps than you would just on the page-based thing. I would be using the students' chat. So these conversations, as I say, if I'm teaching, what are you doing after the class? It becomes part of the conversations that I have each class or every other class. And the answers which come up will obviously be different, and I'd be looking to teach the language that comes up from those students and using that as an opportunity for teaching more language, which may involve teaching sometimes the grammar they haven't studied yet. So they might want to say, I might go out later. So I would teach them I might, but I'm not expecting them to master that. The whole point is it's a process over a long period of time. You could also develop your own materials. So I started writing by having these kinds of conversations, actually kind of doing a dogma type classes often. And I found that I could, that I was teaching slightly different things, and I turned that into materials. Certainly there may be opportunities, different kinds of conversations. I was having a conversation with Anita that some of the conversations in our books are not things that Russians would say, which is fine. I can imagine that is true. So what is the conversation that you would prefer to have? Can you turn that into material? Can you make use of the same kind of principles, if you like? Okay, I think we're almost out of time. 3 other key points. Just remembering that the L1 is an important resource in my principles, if you like. So not only as a translation tool, but just as a knowledge of how conversations work. Basically, although there are different conversations, often many conversations do work in a very similar way across languages. Accuracy is not the goal. In a way, I think we almost should abandon it as a low-level thing. Obviously, we need the students to be able to understood pronunciation-wise. I would correct that a lot. But, for example, if the student said, who are you going? I would be reluctant to maybe correct that. I'd probably just let it go. And the last and most important thing, and this I think goes for all levels, is don't let the students' learning be limited by your idea or the coursebook's idea of level. So the coursebook is not allowing the teaching of might till intermediate, but that doesn't mean to say that we have to. We can make use of the students' language. They understand the meaning because they've just tried to produce it, and we're giving it to them. It's a more enabling, in my view, our way of language. Okay, and I think that's it. Sorry. The last thing, always the last thing, is maybe teaching lexically at higher levels. Basically, the similar things hold, but what we haven't looked at here today, because there's always a kind of short time, is perhaps we might change the method slightly in thinking more about how words work, collocations work, exploring the networks around words. So this is maybe where, if you're familiar with the teaching lexically, you're more familiar with thinking about it as high-level things. I've always thought it's most important at the lowest levels. But you can think about that. Giving grammaticalized examples, responding to students' free speaking, it's the same basic idea, but perhaps we might explore it more often. And then the last thing would be the exploring of networks of words. And if you're interested, there are more ideas in our book, Teaching Lexically, and we do have our summer course, if you're interested in that, where we will explore these in more depth. Thank you very much for coming. Just about on time, I hope. Oh, yeah, okay. Got time? Do we have time? Yeah, any questions? Great, yeah.
Can you turn to the previous slide?
Yes, of course. This one? That one, okay. Oh, yeah. So, yes. You can tell I'm not a great salesman. You know, quick through. So the idea of the book, I shall put on my salesman's hat now. The idea of the book is actually less to do with recipes. So I know teachers like activities to do in class, but in a way, what we're trying to do with the book is to look at different approaches to your course material. And each kind of unit is separated into vocabulary, reading, listening, speaking, and it's trying to look at how you might adjust your teaching techniques to take account of a more lexical approach to language and learning. So the idea is to develop something, make something that you can use in every class rather than in particular activities. Any other questions? There we go. No? Coffee? Thank you. All right, cheers, bye.